The Pacific War was reaching its peak in 1944. The once mighty Japanese Empire faced relentless pressure from Allied forces. Island after island fell. The skies over Japan were filled with American bombers. Faced with overwhelming odds, the Japanese military turned to a desperate and deadly tactic: kamikaze attacks. These suicide attacks, often carried out by young men barely old enough to shave, were meant to terrorize the enemy and slow the Allied advance. The kamikaze, meaning divine wind, were more than just pilots, they were symbols of Japan's last stand. Their sacrifice, fueled by a potent mix of nationalism, duty, and despair, would become one of the most enduring and controversial aspects of World War II. These were not soldiers in the traditional sense, they were weapons, guided by a belief system that saw death in battle as the highest honor. The typical kamikaze pilot was a teenager, often from a middle-class background. Many were students, eager to serve their country in its time of need. They were raised on stories of samurai valor and the divine right of the emperor. They believed that sacrificing themselves for their nation was the ultimate act of patriotism. Their youth made their sacrifice all the more tragic. Boys barely old enough to drive were willingly climbing into airplanes, knowing they would never return. They wrote goodbye letters to their families, expressing love and devotion to their country. Some even apologized for not being able to do more. The training for these young men was brutal and short. Time was of the essence, and the military could not afford to spend months or even years training pilots. The focus was on basic flying skills and attack tactics. They practiced on old, often poorly maintained aircraft. Their targets were often replicas of American ships. Despite the intensity of their training, many of these young pilots were acutely aware of their lack of experience. They knew that their chances of survival were slim. Yet, they pressed on, driven by a sense of duty and a belief in their own mortality. Section 4. Dying for the Emperor, Motivation and Cultural Context. To understand the kamikaze pilots, one must understand the cultural context of wartime Japan. The country was steeped in nationalist propaganda. The emperor was revered as a living god. To die for the emperor was to achieve the highest honor. Surrender was unthinkable. It brought shame upon oneself and one's family. The pilots were told that their sacrifice would turn the tide of the war. They were promised that their deaths would save their families and their nation. They were hailed as heroes, their names enshrined in Shinto shrines. Their families, though grieving, were often proud of their sacrifice. Section 5. A legacy etched in history, remembering the kamikaze. The kamikaze pilots remain a controversial subject. Some view them as fanatical victims of a brutal regime. Others see them as courageous patriots who made the ultimate sacrifice for their country. Regardless of one's perspective, their story is a stark reminder of the human cost of war. The kamikaze pilots' legacy is complex and tragic. They were both perpetrators and victims of war's brutality. Their story compels us to remember the human cost of conflict and to strive for a future where such sacrifices are never again required.